the line below.
From beginning.
That's it. Marvelous. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. Well, good evening, everyone. If you happen to be a member of ASSAP's Facebook group, you will receive periodic messages, links sent to you by various people, podcasts and such like, and you're probably invited to join other Facebook groups concerned with the paranormal. Most of the material you receive in this way will probably be quite dodgy in terms of its authenticity or the high degree of factual content. A typical kind of post you may get is Bedfordshire's 10 most haunted pubs, or the most haunted places in Essex, or the most haunted places in Northumberland. Now, there's a nonsensical assumption here of, obviously, I say obviously, but it should be obvious, but maybe it's not obvious to everyone, that there's some kind of reliable data bank that's constantly updating very scientific information, which is separating out fantasy from fiction, constantly adding new information, carrying out very detailed and scientific statistical comparisons and rankings, and therefore the place that's listed first on the list of the most haunted is indeed the most haunted, and the one at the bottom is lower on the ranking. This is of course nonsense. And even leaving aside these ranking type posts, lots of posts come through, often with quite flashy pictures, nice pictures of stately mansions, castles, and so on, and talking about ghostly phenomena. And yet behind these superficial reports, there may be very little research. And some of these cases may come up again and again. Now, when I was young, perhaps a child or at least a teenager, I became interested in the paranormal, and one of the cases I read about then was the alleged apparitional replays of the Battle of Edgehill. I'll go into these matters in some detail shortly, but just in brief, this was a battle in the Civil War, the English Civil War. It was fought in 1642, and the claim was that some weeks after the battle, there were apparitional replays of the battle in the area concerned, that the king, who was based at that point at Oxford, got to hear about the events and sent a delegation of 6 men to investigate, and they personally witnessed the ghostly proceedings. Now, at that time, being quite young, I actually believed the story, and I thought, well, this is great. This sort of validates claims about paranormal, and here we have a kind of royal commission validating claims of the paranormal. And I took it at sort of face value. Some years ago, I think it was probably about 16 years ago, I teamed up with another researcher, Dr. Alan Gould, and we started looking in depth at the claims about the apparitional replays of the Battle of Edgehill. It was actually the research we did was, from a personal point of view, at least, I found it quite difficult and tiring. It involved traveling to libraries, and in my case, I went down to Warwickshire. I live in Scotland, but I went down to Warwickshire, to the Warwickshire Record Office, one of my visits, to collect data. I'm not the most equipped person for historical research because I don't understand Latin. I don't read Latin. And if you go back in English history, several centuries, a lot of official documents are in Latin. So it wasn't easy, but we looked at numerous sources, and we came up with essentially negative conclusions, which I'll go into shortly. And yet this story about the Battle of Edgehill is one of others, perhaps, that come up repeatedly. You'll find this story mentioned in numerous books, appears on the internet, as recently as January of this year, in an issue of the online free magazine, Phenomena magazine, there was a report about it, which was deficient in some respects. In 2012, a man called Roger Clark published a book called A Natural History of Ghosts, which, although it did contain some well-researched material, it mentioned the Edgehill case with some deficiencies. Or a deficiency in the sense that it didn't mention one of the sources. So this is, I think, a case that highlights the fact that, we've got to be careful in taking things at face value. Simply because a case is often mentioned and repeated doesn't mean it's true. And I think with Edgehill, the case of Edgehill, people probably, as I did when I was younger, tend to assume that because the case is so often mentioned, that someone somewhere along the line has done the basic historical research and found corroborating evidence, which may not be the case. Now, this is, as I say, a Phantom Army case, which I'll go into. Possibly it's the best known Phantom Army case in the British Isles. The second, perhaps best known case is one concerning a hill in the Lake District. And I think the locals may pronounce it Souter Fell. It looks like Souter Fell. It depends on where you come from. But I think that the pronunciation may be Souter Fell. It's just north of the A66 as you're heading west towards Keswick. And just to give you a little bit of orientation, if you're coming from the south and you're driving up the M6 and you turn off at the Penrith turn off, you get to a big roundabout. And if you then go left, that is west towards Keswick, you'll eventually pass Souter Fell on your right to the north of the A66. And this again is one of these cases where people often mention it. And in both the Edgehill and the Souter Fell cases, there are two early sources which describe the supposed events. But some of these reports you'll see in books and on the internet seem to be aware of only one source. Now, the reason why this missing source question is important is because the two early historical sources differ quite considerably to some extent. And therefore, when it comes to questioning whether these stories are true, you really need to know both stories. So just to go into a bit of detail, the Battle of Edgehill was, as I say, it was the first major clash of the English Civil War. This was a war between the Royalists supporting King Charles I and Parliament. Now, prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, there had been a long period of tension between Parliament and the King, and there were various issues revolving around the right to raise taxes, religious matters. Basically, the King believed, Charles I believed in the divine right of kings to sort of rule more or less as they wished, whereas the parliamentarians wanted to sort of cut back those powers and share power with the king rather than allow the king sort of untrammeled, reign. And eventually these tensions got to the point where there was a civil war. And the Battle of Edgehill in October 1642 was the first major clash of this war. At the time, the king and his forces were planning to move towards London. The king, I should say, and the royalist forces were probably best represented in the west and the northern parts of Britain, whereas the parliamentarians were strongest in the southeast and east, maybe the ports and south, and certainly they were strong in the London area. And the king's strategic objective, was to take London. Now, in the course of moving towards London, the royalist forces came close to the parliamentarian forces near Kyneton in Warwickshire, and they fought a battle on the 23rd of October. It's sort of said that the outcome of the battle wasn't really very decisive. I think maybe tactically the royalists came out a bit better. but strategically it was perhaps not to the advantage of the parliamentary of the royalists, because their intention was to march on London, and this slowed down their approach to London. And by the time they resumed their march towards London, the parliamentarians had strengthened the defences. And the king, in fact, never reached London and never took it, and indeed eventually went on to lose the war and was eventually beheaded, I think in 1649. The royalists, as I say, were under the command of the king at the battle, and the parliamentarians were under the command of Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex. Now, as I say, it was several weeks after the battle that the alleged ghostly replays occurred, which were reported in two pamphlets or tracts, as they're sometimes called, published or supposedly published in January 1643. If you actually look at the pamphlets, you may be a bit confused if you're not aware of the changes in the calendar, because the pamphlets give the date as January 1642. But at that time, the official year began on the 25th of March. Consequently, January, rather than being the first month of the year, occurred towards the end of the year. And indeed, this sort of reflection of the old calendar can be seen to some extent in our modern way of referring to months. Take October, the prefix oct suggests 8, the 8th month of the year, but we think of it as the 10th month of the year. But that 8th month of the year bit goes back to this earlier calendar. But that's just on the side that the pamphlets, as I say, in terms of the modern calendar, were published in January 1643. There were two pamphlets, and some authors who refer to the alleged events and their sources seem to be unaware of one of the pamphlets, the second one. Just before I go on to discuss the pamphlets, this is just a memorial to the battle near the area of near Kyneton in Warwickshire. This is actually on Ministry of Defence land now. I visited it some time ago, and I got permission with someone kindly arranged for me and him to visit the site, and the authorities allowed us to do that. Now the two pamphlets, one of them is called A Great Wonder in Heaven. I'll use that title for short, and I've given you here on the slide just a little bit of detail about it, using largely the original language. There are immediately problems with this, actually. It says there's a great wonder in heaven, showing the late apparitions and prodigious noises of war and battles seen on Edgehill near Kyneton in Northamptonshire. Now, in fact, Kyneton and the battlefield aren't in Northamptonshire, they're in Warwickshire. And Alan Gould and I ascertained from the Warwickshire Record Office, I think it was, that Kyneton has never been in Northamptonshire. So we've got a geographical error here concerning this particular pamphlet, which, if you think that the pamphlet may have been a fabrication, one could understand how that error could have occurred. And you'll see it's certified under the hands of William Wood and a Samuel Marshall, preacher of God's word in Kyneton. Preacher of God's word in Kyneton perhaps suggests the vicar and other unnamed persons of quality. Now, in the course of our research, we discovered that the vicar in Kyneton at the time wasn't a Samuel Marshall. It was actually a man called Richard Fisher. And we considered the possibility that maybe Fisher had been unwell, perhaps for a period, and someone had stood in for him. And we looked at that possibility, but we found no evidence that someone called Samuel Marshall had stood in for Richard Fisher as the vicar at Kyneton. Kyneton, I hasten to add, is now spelled Kineton. That sort of spelling looks a bit German, but the modern spelling, as I say, with Ineton. Another possibility we considered was, well, could this Samuel Marshall have been a nonconformist minister? It seems unlikely, particularly given that the second pamphlet, which I'll be going on to discuss in a moment, says that Marshall visited the king at Oxford and reported the ghostly events to him. Now, the king, King Charles I, was a high Anglican, if not a crypto-Catholic. And one might question whether a man like Charles I would have received a nonconformist minister, particularly perhaps given that Charles I, as king, was actually the formal head of the Church of England at the time. Now, the second pamphlet, this is one that some people don't seem to know about, but published allegedly within just days of the first one. You see here again, different spelling of Kyneton. I don't know whether that's of any significance, whether spellings changed or not then in those years, or whether this reflects a lack of education on the part of the people who wrote the pamphlets. I'm not sure about that. It also says that these two pamphlets have been, this pamphlet, as with the other one, has been certified under the hands of William Wood and Samuel Marshall, again described as the preacher of God's word in the village. Now, as I'll indicate, the problem here is the pamphlets differ in what they say, how they depict the battle. So you have to ask yourself, well, if these two pamphlets really were certified by William Wood, who held a position of supposedly of responsibility, and also another person of responsibility, Samuel Marshall, would they have put their names to two different documents that differed significantly regarding the actual detail? I think that's doubtful. The alleged witnesses mentioned in the first pamphlet, Great Wonder in Heaven, as I said, Samuel Marshall, William Wood, and then we've got three other named witnesses. It was claimed that there were ghostly replays of the battle, and the king got to hear about it, sent a delegation of 6 men. And the two pamphlets both name 3 of the men. They don't mention all of them. And the 3 named men are these 3, Colonel Lewis Kirk, a Captain Dudley, and a Captain Wainman, a Winman. The pamphlets say that Marshall, the first one says that Marshall would personally witness the, doesn't say that whether they, the second pamphlet, sorry, doesn't say whether they personally witnessed the ghostly events. But it does say, as I've said, that the 6 royal representatives did witness them. So problems with these pamphlets. The two pamphlets differ about what happened. For instance, the first pamphlet depicts the apparitional events, ghostly events, as occurring as if it were projected into the sky. Whereas New Year's Wonder, the second pamphlet, refers to some of the ghostly events being experienced within the village of Kyneton itself. Now that doesn't occur in the first pamphlet. As I've mentioned, the first pamphlet gets the county wrong. As I checked briefly today, and I don't think the second pamphlet actually names the county. They make the mistake about the name of the vicar. And perhaps more importantly, Alan Gould and I found no evidence confirming that the alleged events came to the attention of the king and that he sent a delegation to investigate them. It would probably be tedious if I would go into all the sort of sources we checked on that. And if anyone's wanting detail on that, I'd be happy to send him or her, you know, the information. But we looked at various sources, royal records and such like, and we found no evidence of that. I should say that the three men I've mentioned, Dudley, Captain Kirk and Captain Wainman or Winman, they did exist. They were historical characters, but it's quite possible that the authors of the pamphlets knew that these were well-known royalists and therefore used their names. We were able to look at records pertaining to them, and we found no evidence that they had actually taken part in a royal commission. There are other problems perhaps about the pamphlets as well. If you, one of them is, it concerns this man Wood, whom I've mentioned, who's supposedly certified the documents. One of the pamphlets more or less says that he was a coward. It's not quite as explicit as that, but it said that some of the people kind of were so frightened by the ghostly apparition, the ghostly events, that they left the area. They kind of sought habitations elsewhere, one of them being William Wood. Now, Wood was supposedly one of the people who certified the pamphlets. So it seems unlikely to me that if someone presents a pamphlet to you that contains claims that you were maybe lacking a bit in moral fiber, that you'd happily sign it. So there are internal one or two internal problems, perhaps more than one or two, plus these problems I've already mentioned. My personal conjectures about this case are that the two pamphlets were probably fabricated, possibly by the same person or people, for the purpose of religious or political propaganda. This Samuel Marshall and William Wood, Alan Gould and I weren't able to confirm whether they existed, and my guess is, it's conjecture, I can't say for sure it's true, that they didn't exist. And the pamphlets may have drawn on, but grossly exaggerated, stories of ghostly sightings in the area. Regarding this, I'll just read from an article that Alan Gould and I had published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. It'll give you a little bit of background to what I'm referring to here about possible ghostly sightings in the area. A volume of the memoirs of the antiquarian Anthony Wood is a frequently cited source of information relating to Oxford at the time of the Civil War, but it contains nothing of relevance for January and early February 1643, and neither does the accompanying index volume. However, Wood was only a boy at the time and did not have access to court circles. A potentially more revealing source might have been the Court Mercury, a weekly publication that ran from the first week of January 1643 until the 9th of September 1645. It has been reprinted in full I won't bother naming the source there, but however, there appears to be nothing directly relevant to a phantom battle near Kyneton or Edgehill in the issues for January, February, or the first week of March of 1643. Possibly, though, the dispatch of a commission to investigate apparitional proceedings would not have been considered appropriate for mention in the publication. None of the sources on Charles I that we have consulted mentions the appointment of a commission to investigate ghostly events in the Kyneton, Edgehill area. And Ronald Hutton, a historian who has written about the Royalist war effort, informed the first author, that's myself, that he couldn't recall encountering any reference to these matters in royal or noble correspondence and diaries from the relevant period, although he noted that invented stories, for example, about big battles that had never occurred, had been in circulation in tracts at the time. It's possible that the pamphlets drew on and exaggerated stories circulating at the time. John Green, a lawyer of Lincoln's Inn, recorded in his diary for the 19th of January 1643, that is before the date given for either of the two pamphlets, there are now diverse reports of strange sights seen and strange noises heard at Edgehill, where our last battle was fought, in the place where the king's army stood terrible outcries, where the parliament stood music and singing psalms. Raymond, 1993, quotes the following, which appears in a news book for the 17th to 24th of January, 1643. The letters about Banbury say that the cavaliers in the castle there are frighted by the sight of a great man that walks in a surplice, and that about Edgehill and Kyneton there are men seen walking with one leg, but one arm and the like, passing to and fro in the night. And according to Verney and Verney, 1904, Sir Edmund Verney's ghost, quote, long continued to haunt not only the battlefield where he fell, but the old house where he dwelt and the spinney surrounding it, unquote. Durston, 1987, notes that reports of wonders were recruited for propaganda purposes in the 17th century. The pamphlets were, of course, printed during the Civil War, and it's possible that their contents were shaped by propagandist motives rather than by a desire to record historical facts. The first pamphlet doesn't appear to be strongly tendentious, but it interprets the apparitional phenomena as, quote, doubtlessly a sign of God's wrath against the land for these civil wars. The second pamphlet is more explicit in lamenting the civil war and refers to evil counsellors which are about the king. So they're my conjectures. They are conjectures, but as I say, the pamphlets I suspect are largely BS, but they may have drawn on some rumours, which themselves may not be historically reliable. The next case concerns the Lake District, a hill, as I've said, called Souter Fell. This is it. It's not a very impressive hill. In terms of size, I would say it's a middle range hill. In terms of height, it's about 1,712, 13 feet. The highest peak in England is about 3,200 feet, Scawfell Pikes. In fact, England only has 4 mountains that go over 3,000 feet. Souter Fell, as I say, about half that. So it's not a terribly dramatic thing. I think probably the most notable thing about Souter Fell is the fact that it's now associated with some supernatural folklore. And as I've said before, it's in the Northern Lake District. If you're going west on the A66 towards Keswick, you'll pass the southern end of Souter Fell. It's a sort of sausage-shaped hill, and the northern end is near the hamlet of Mungrisdale. So I've been on the hill myself, and as you can see, it's nothing terribly dramatic. This is a view looking from the southeast of the hill. This line along here is the A66, and that's east, and that's going towards Keswick. I think that may be Ullswater, I'm not sure. Now, as with the Edgehill case, there are 2 early but discrepant sources. An article or letter, a lengthy letter, appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1947. It's actually in the magazine, as I recall it, the name of the author isn't given, but I think it's George Smith, a Scotsman. I think he may have lived in Cumbria at the time, but who was a frequent writer for the Gentleman's Magazine. And the second source is this chap, James Clark, quite a bit later, but still relatively speaking, an early source. Now, as I say, as with the Edgehill case, you'll find reports about the Souter Fell story, and people may only be aware of one source. And the trouble with only being aware of one source is when you've got discrepant sources, you're not getting a balanced picture. So according to Smith, and I'm summarizing a bit here, but there were 3 sightings according to Smith. Midsummer Eve is the 23rd of June. It's not the longest day of the year, Midsummer's Day, 24th of June. It's not the longest day of the year. The longest day of the year is, I think, the 21st of June. But for some reason, the 24th of June is or was called Midsummer's Day. So Midsummer Eve, the 23rd of June. a servant of a man called William Lancaster supposedly saw an army marching for over an hour on the eastern side of Souter Fell. A couple of years later, William Lancaster himself saw the army, and this was again a protracted sighting. And as it went on, the marching troops, if that's what we're supposed to think they were, kind of seemed to be proceeding a less disciplined way. The next sighting, again, suspiciously, in my view, on the very same day of the year. This to me has a sort of folkloric flavor, you know, something occurring on a particular day of the year repeatedly. 1745, it happened again, and Lancaster was involved again. Other people were summoned and allegedly witnessed the spectacle. 1745 was the year of the Second Jacobite Rebellion, involving Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Charles Edward Stuart. Charles Edward Stuart landed in the Hebrides and went on to the mainland. He raised an army. It eventually moved south into England. I think it got as far as Derby. I think that was the high point, or the furthest point south that the Jacobites got, and they were eventually defeated at Culloden in 1746. And some people who seem to have taken the story of these sightings, or at least the 1745 one, seriously, have suggested that what was seen was a kind of mirage of Jacobite troops marshalling or manoeuvring in Scotland, which is physically, I think, an absurd notion that something seen on the eastern side of Souter Fell in the Lake District was a mirage of something occurring in the Western Highlands. And it doesn't take account, of course, of the fact that, or doesn't fit with the claim that there were sightings as early as 1735. So this is Smith's account. Smith wrote his article in 1747, or that's when it was published, not too long after the last of these alleged events. So in terms of the closeness in time, you might think this is the most reliable story account, although whether Smith was an entirely reliable informant, I'm not sure. The second version is completely different. This is James Clark. The first signing wasn't actually, it did involve Souter Fell, but it wasn't actually of an army. As you'll see, a man pursuing horses seemed to be running at an amazing pace. The next sighting, again, same day, Midsummer's Eve, 23rd of June, 1944, but 1944, not 1744, not 1735, 1737, or 1745, but a different year, 1744. One of the participants earlier was working as a servant for William Lancaster's father. And men were seen going along the mountain, and again it was a protracted sighting going on, according to Clark, for at least 2.5 hours. Now I'm just going to go back to this picture. I mean, that William Lancaster, I think, was based here at Blake Hills Farm. Now, in the course of my investigations, I called in at, I think, as I recall, I called in at Blake Hills and spoke to this was maybe 16 years ago or something like that, spoke to presumably the owner or proprietor, who seemed to be aware of the legend about Souter Fell, but certainly didn't give me any indication he personally had witnessed anything. I mean, I've been there more than once. I think there's a pub at Mungrisdale, and I on one of my visits to the pub there, I did discuss the sightings, and they had a little booklet or pamphlet about the sightings, which I suppose give a folklore interest to the area. But the person I spoke to didn't say anything about, yeah, we've actually witnessed it ourselves. So there was no sort of clear-cut reason to think that this is an ongoing haunting. Now, I should say that with regard to this case, I'm again very dubious, because we've got two very contradictory sort of sources, early sources. However, in 2005, Mrs. Patricia Hovey, a woman from Cumbria, a local historian, informed me that she had been working in connection with attempts to preserve the Settle to I think it was the Carlisle to Settle railway. And in the course of that work with another historian, she'd met a couple who told her that before the last war, I presume that means World War II, they'd travelled from London to visit a friend who was a doctor in charge of a TB sanatorium at the foot of Blencathra. Blencathra is a mountain just to the west of Souter Fell. And it was dark, and the road was old. It was on the road was quiet. Suddenly, the woman grabbed her husband's arm and shouted to him to stop. He pulled over. His wife had seen soldiers marching across the road, but he hadn't seen anything. And the woman insisted on getting out of the car to look for what she thought would be the dead or injured men. Now, I don't know whether this couple had travelled from London in one day to get to the Lake District. If they had, it would have been quite a tiring journey, because of course if this was just before the Second World War, there would have been no motorways. It would have been a long journey, and it's possible they got up very early to do that journey, and it's possible that the woman was sleep deprived. And I suppose if that's the case, she may have experienced a hypnagogic hallucination, a sort of hallucination that can occur when one is on the edge of sleep. I've had the experience myself. I remember hitchhiking on I think it was the A1 many years ago, and I was in the cab of a lorry, and as I was looking at the cat's eyes on the road in the early hours of the morning on the edge of sleep, they were suddenly turning into something else. And I'd class that as a hypnagogic hallucination or illusion. I think I realized it wasn't true, so perhaps it wasn't a true hallucination, but as I say, with this woman, it's conceivable that what she experienced was related to sleep deprivation. Mrs. Hovey asked the woman what the soldiers looked like, but unfortunately she couldn't remember. So evidentially, the second-hand testimony isn't terribly useful. If she'd said that the soldiers were wearing red coats and looked as if they were from the 18th century, it would have been perhaps more remarkable. But and it's conceivable, indeed, I suppose, and perhaps not likely, but even conceivable, that what she saw were real soldiers from the 20th century, maybe members of the Territorial Army on a night exercise. Although if that had been the case, I doubt whether the soldiers would have been marching across the road. I imagine they'd been crossing the road in sort of combat mode. The incident supposedly occurred on the road to Blencathra, that is what's the A60, we call the A66. And it may be that it happened as the couple were passing the southern end of Souter Fell. So a fragment of something that might suggest that there could occasionally be odd incidents in the area, but nothing very clear cut. She also told me, Mrs. Hovey also referred to a woman who told her at some point that she and her husband farmed at the foot of Souter Fell and had often heard the pounding of hooves, jingling of harnesses, and men shouting. She said that it was so common to hear these things that they thought nothing of it, but she'd never actually seen anything. Now, this is interesting. As I say, when I called at Blake Hill's farm, the man there didn't seem to know of any, didn't seem to have had any sort of experiences. This is a second-hand report. I'm not quite sure what we can take from it. It's intriguing. It's perhaps raises the possibility that there could perhaps be a little bit of substance to the Souter Fell story, which doesn't mean that those two pamphlets are at all accurate. So that's it really with these two cases. They're perhaps the best known English Phantom Army cases, and they've both got a lot of problems with them. If you're a person who looks at these kind of items that are circulated on the internet, you'll probably receive a post about one or other of these cases. And if you look at the post, you may find that it's missing information about the sources. It mentions only one source. And maybe takes an uncritical view of it, or maybe the writer presupposes, but because these stories have been repeated year after year, that someone along the line has checked them out and found to be true. Well, I think I'll stop there actually, and open for questioning if anyone wants to ask anything. Do you want me to stop the share now, CJ, or keep it on?
Yeah, if you stop it at this point and we can see you.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Oh, we can't see you at all, actually. Have you got...
Right. Right. Share screen again.
It should be your camera. Have you got a camera?
I've got a one in my lid of my laptop, but
okay. Well, hopefully we could see you on that. Maybe try. Let's see if I can work out how to ask to start video. Right, I've sent you a request to start video.
okay.
We'll stop sharing this, and hopefully we'll be able to see you. There we go. There we go.
Good. Good.
So if we stop sharing screen now.
Okay.
Good evening. It's good to see you. Okay. So let's begin at the beginning. Fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I remember many years ago, I read a book or a journal article called "Who Are the Falsifiers? The Paranormal in Print." I can't remember who wrote it, but it cast doubt upon Souter Fell, but it didn't cast doubt upon Edgehill. I think it was
right.
But I know that you and Ellen wrote this. What year was it that you published your account? Because it was in the 90s, wasn't it?
No, it was April 2005. It was published. Yeah.
JSPR, yeah?
SPR, yeah, JSPR, yes.
Yeah, so we could possibly, if anyone's interested, if you go to Lexi and if you're an SPR member, you'd be able to find the article, and that would be really interesting to go and have a look back at. So thank you for doing that tonight. I was amused. Was it January 1650 new calendar that King Charles was executed? I believe it was, because it's 1649 old calendar, January 1650, and you then went on to explain precisely that. So
right. I can't remember. Yes.
Year either, but I know that it was in a different year because the calendar changed. It's one of the things we used to teach our students about primary sources and about, you don't. It's like the Orthodox Christmas. It's something that people don't realise and don't recognise. Anyway, fantastic talk. So let's start with questions. The first question is from the very beginning of the evening, if I can find it. Here we go. Ian Rowley, can Peter recommend any ASSAP related reading material for that after Christmas post dinner lull? What book would you like to recommend? And in fact, I'm just going to go and try and grab one now. Show.
I suppose it depends what subject within the paranormal or anomaly realm the person is interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Just grabbing. This is one of my favourite books on the paranormal. I'll put the camera back on now that I've managed to go and pick it up. I'll start video. I hope you didn't all just see my bottom as I crawled across the bed. Right, here we go. There is Peter's first book, Zones of Strangeness, which in my case, I took with me to my mother's funeral of all places, but that's because I was still reading it in the car on the way there. It is a superb book, and it takes quite a lot to distract me from my mother's funeral. So there you go. That kept me going all the way through Suffolk. And he's written two other books, which I highly recommend, which are far easier to find. But if you can get a copy of this one, then please do. It's not available as an electronic publication. It's only available as a physical book, but it's a very big physical book.
I can tell there's a story about that. I may have mentioned it before, but I published that one through a company called Author House. And when I looked at the e-version, I was appalled because there were things that were wrong about it. Italics had disappeared. And I contacted them and tried to get these areas changed. But when I got one thing changed, then something else would crop up. And I got fed up having to reread my own book to check, whether. So I eventually said, look, can you just pull the book, the ebook? I'd rather not have the book out there with sort of, I'm not happy about it, and just leave the print version. So that's a story behind that. Another problem, actually, more generally, not to do with me personally, but I don't know if this is always the case, but ebooks don't seem to have indexes, do they?
No, some of them do. Some of them, there's a kind of way in which you can open it up.
Oh, right.
It depends on the Kindle system. There seems to be a way of finding chapters, but
Yeah,
because the pagination changes depending upon
that's right.
the zoom, you therefore can only hypertext link them. Goodness, that's taking me back 30 years, isn't it? But
Yeah.
it's my somewhat balding cat talking past. Sorry about that.
But
Right.
I find that with a big book, particularly, not having an index can be a real pain. If you put the book down, you forget who Joe Smith is or something, and you want to and then you've got to kind of spend half an hour I'm exaggerating, trying to find the name. If there isn't an index, it can make life difficult.
I tried to just go onto my genealogy site to search for Samuel Marshall's in Cainston to see if there was ever one there. And I got the parish register and I went to the National Archives. I mean, this is research now that is so much easier than the time you were doing it, because a large number of documents are now available. Of course, as you say, the majority still require going to physical record offices and actual research. And the fact that nobody does that basic research. I'll give you an example of this. Sometime around about 1992 or 3, and I can remember because I go by girlfriends, it was Claire the Goldfish had turned up, and I was dating Polly. So yeah, it's 93. I received a request from a chap called John Humphreys to take a look at his house called the Ancient Ram Inn. And we went down there, and about 3 years later, we went back several times, and we recorded what he told us, and we investigated the building, and we wrote a fairly complicated report. And we have a copy here, CPRG, but we also left a copy with the library at the SPR. And then we disappeared off, and we didn't go back until 96 when we went back, where I encountered a strange group that I'd never met or heard of called ASSAP, and that was my first encounter with ASSAP. And I gave them a load of SPR journals and disappeared and didn't see them again for another decade until I joined again. Anyway, during that time, the Ancient Ram Inn became something of a legend in paranormal circles, as they call themselves, and ghost hunters go there all the time, and poor old John is no longer with us. But despite the fact that we published reports and mentioned our research in the journals and in the Sci Researcher, since 1993, nobody has ever come to me, or as far as I know, the SPR, and asked to see our original records, our original archive research, and our investigation of the Humphreys case. Nobody has, yet the Ancient Ram Inn has gone on to receive incredible degrees of fame, but nobody comes and asks for the. And we went through the archives, we found a lot of interesting material, and we found what appeared to have been in the late 80s a short-lived poltergeist case that gave rise to a lot of the stuff that's supposed to have occurred there, but which was of a limited duration. And then, what was another thing that's interesting is we mentioned Warwickshire tonight. And in the 1990s, 95, 96, Warwickshire's local newspaper published an article on ghosts of Warwick Castle. About 6 years later, I was researching for a show called Most Haunted, and I was asked to put together information on the ghosts of Warwick Castle. So I went there and I spoke to the staff, and I looked at the information. And then when I came back, Most Haunted did it as well. Their other researchers went, and they did a presentation of the traditional famous hauntings of Warwick Castle. There was almost no agreement in 15 years on the hauntings. Some of them were recognisably the same, but names had changed, who it happened to, where it happened to had changed. And I was able, using the 15 years earlier thing, to track down some of the original witnesses. But in 15 years, the ghost stories had evolved beyond any kind of recognition. And nobody, and this is just the shifting nature of folklore, I guess. And the final example of that was this week when I published it in the ASSAP group, Tom Slemen, I think, was the author who's been quoted. They've published an article about a supposed devil's footprints occurrence in 1845 or 46, I can't remember the year, in Liverpool. And it's just the Barnstaple devil's footprints case taken directly and relocated to Liverpool to make it relevant locally. Anyway, enough of all that. Let's move on to the questions. Hello, Peter. I bought your book, Paranormal Encounters on Britain's Roads, Phantom Figures, UFOs, and Missing, new in 2018. It's one of the best I've read. I've seen 2 road ghosts. Is it likely to be a real encounter? Oh, Graham, come on. You've got to come and talk to us. Where are you? Graham, can you unmute? You could ask this question yourself. See, the two of you can have a conversation. Here you go. He might be able to...
Yes, I think it's unmuted now. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, as I put in the comment there, I've seen 2 road ghosts. One was on the A38 near Wellington, which I believe is supposed to be haunted by a hitchhiker, actually, but that's not what I saw at all. CJ knows the story. And then the second one was near Thetford with my other half and her father. And it was a car coming towards us with lights on in the darkness. And as we drew near, we waited for it at a bridge, and nothing came, and it completely disappeared and couldn't have turned around or anything.
Can I quickly interrupt on there? The second one, the second case was Thetford, was it?
Yeah, just outside of Thetford, yeah.
Where outside of Thetford? This being rather important to me.
Oh, it's got a special name for the bridge, and I cannot remember for the life of me what it's called.
What, the Three Nuns Bridges?
Pardon?
The Three Nuns Bridges, as you're...
Oh, that's it. Yes, Three Nuns Bridges, yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. I never knew you'd had an experience at the Three Nuns Bridges. Did you not go there with the SPS?
Yeah, we did do it. It was after that.
So you knew that my mother had an experience there before you had your experience?
Yeah, so I never said anything to my other half, but
you just heard about the experience. Is that all right?
Yeah, so I think it was about this time of year, 6 years ago, maybe, something like that. And we were going to the bridge. I can't remember which way we were going. I think actually we might have been going towards Thetford. And there was a car coming the other way, and it looked as though it wasn't modern, just because of the lights. And you get to a bit where it's like a humpback almost. And we'd stayed and waited for it to come. And the lights were there, and then there was just blackness. So you could have seen the outline of the car. So I wouldn't have said it was a modern car, but it wasn't like a 1930s car. So it's probably something like 50s onwards, I suppose. And yeah, it just totally disappeared. There was nothing. It was like it just erased. So I'm not aware of any accidents that are there, but it was an interesting one, certainly. And we just could not explain it. And unlike the first incident that happened to me when I was near Wellington, which is where I used to live, the second one, there were 2 other witnesses. So I didn't hallucinate it, kind of thing. And I wasn't driving either, so I had probably a little bit more time to take it in. But the other one was roughly where the Phantom Hitchhiker is supposed to be. So I already knew the story. And it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and pitch black, as it always is. And there was going towards it, and then this like bright white dog that was transparent just jumped straight out of a hedge on one side of the road and right in front of me, so that I banged on the brakes and I hit it. And as I did that and came to a stop, a car came out of a side road with some drunk teenagers in it. I assume they were drunk or messing around, and they'd lost control of the car slightly, so overshot and went into the hedge on the other side of the road, but it kind of scraped it and carried on. But the second that the dog had been there, if it hadn't have done it, I would have got hit in the driver's door, and it would have been pretty hard, if not almost a fatal accident. So it was a bizarre one, but it wasn't the haunting that road is supposed to be famous for. So I thought that was an interesting one. So I have said that one to CJ, and
what year was
that? That would have been in the early 2000s, so probably somewhere around 2001 to 2004.
Right.
I wonder whether Graham would be good enough to send me a written account of those experiences for my files, as it were, and I could possibly, if I'm writing again about that subject, I could mention it with his name disguised if necessary, if I wish. If that sounds very interesting, Graham.
Yeah, it was interesting. Actually, Ian Rowley's has put in the comments precognitive apparition. That's exactly what I thought, and I've obviously spoken with CJ about that before, and is a possibility. But I think the second one, which was the Thetford one, although we'd been there, I didn't remember much of what CJ had said. And it was a totally different incident again. So that's what made it interesting. And there's witnesses to that one, which was interesting.
On a slightly lighter note, but I was talking to my sister on the phone the other day, and we were talking about our late mother. My mother died in 2016. She was 99. And when I was out with her in the car and I was using the satellite navigation and the voice was speaking, she seemed to find difficulty in not believing it was a real person. And the same thing happened with my sister. And one day they were going down a road and the satellite navigation woman, in inverted commas, told my sister to turn left. And it was actually a farm track. It wasn't a proper road. And my sister says something like, "Oh, shut up, you stupid bitch." And my mother said, "You shouldn't talk to that lady like that."
Oh dear. We actually we had the reason I took Graham to the spot was I used to take the Student Parapsychology Society out on investigations when I was lecturing, or after I was lecturing, I think, down at the local uni, and we used to take them all over the country in a minibus quite often and spend a weekend or a long weekend staying at haunted hotels and going to different sites and doing some research. But we didn't just visit; we actually did some actual research when we were there. And on this particular occasion, I took them to a place where I've had one of my very few experiences. I've been in the back of the car, I didn't see anything at all. And my mother and father were driving back from Stetson Market up through Thetford, and there's three bridges in a row called the Three Nuns Bridges, which are humpback medieval bridges. And they're one of the main routes into town. But the thing about them is they're a narrow road, only large enough for one car to pass. And you've got two rivers that join there. So one bridge goes onto an island, one bridge then covers over the other side of the island, and then the third bridge crosses the second river. But they're in a sequence of about 50 yards. So it's a very small, narrow area, and the only place you can turn on either side is a very narrow piece of grass, which is an island, and there's nowhere to go, basically, and there's no cover because it's open. So when Graham says that there could be no way that the car disappeared, your immediate thought is, well, maybe the lights were further over than he thought. But there's a flint wall that travels around a curve. And as such, you can't see up to the dolphin. The actual line of sight is completely blocked. So if he saw a vehicle and it did not come over the bridge, it did not exist. You know, those lights were not a physical vehicle because there is nowhere there. If he was coming in towards Thetford from Bury, there is nowhere at all where car could have gone. And in fact, if you look up Thetford Norfolk on Google Maps and just look at a road that cuts diagonally into Thetford towards Castle Hill or the Dolphin Pub, you will be able to find the three bridges and look at the photos and see the situation yourself, which would be a good bit of research for anyone interested, and check if what I'm saying is true. My experience there was 14 years old. We were coming back. We were going over the bridges the opposite direction through Thetford. As we reached the third bridge, which is where Graham's car would have been at the time, I was reading a book on the back seat, as I used to, being a fat, tedious child, and I was suddenly thrown onto the floor and slammed into the back of my parents. And my mother, I think, was wearing a safety belt and was thrown all over the place. And my poor father was thrown about. And he turned around and said, "What are you doing, you bloody woman? You bloody stupid woman!" And she said, "The lady walked in front of me. Did I hit her?" And got out of the car and started running around. And my father said he saw nothing at all. And he insisted it must have been a shadow from a lamppost. But she said she clearly saw a woman step out quite intentionally and look at her in front of her. And I said, "Did she look like a nun or something like that?" And she said she was wearing dark clothes. It was about 4 o'clock. and it was either November or late or December. It was only just got dark, and she was convinced she'd hit a real woman. So my father got out, they investigated, there was no one there. So when we went to Thetford, I took Graham to the spot, and I'm wondering if somehow he could have telepathically created, having forgotten the details of the ghost, he could have somehow transferred by telepathy the apparition to everybody else in the car that evening and created his own. Because that's what the SPR researchers in the 1890s would have said with their telepathic theories of ghosts. But that's the original, that's my story from that bridge. So sorry about the tedious interruption. Back to the plot. Next question, please. Caroline. You want to tell us about that, Caroline?
Sorry?
Caroline's got a question. I'm just going to ask her to unmute.
Hi. I can turn my video on as well.
Yep.
Hi. We run a group in Somerset called Somerset Paranormal Investigations UK, and we try to stick bits up around the area of interest for people with paranormal. So mainly hauntings. We don't really look at anything else, just mainly hauntings. So we put this thing up that Graham had mentioned about the A38, just for interest people about this raggedy old person that was seen walking along the street. And he says, crikey, are people still talking about this nowadays? That was my dad that had witnessed that. And it was his story that we told. And it was really interesting that he'd come to us and told us. So he remembers his dad and his mum telling everybody about the story about this raggedy old man that was there. And they'd actually picked him up as a hitchhiker, I think, for a while as well. And he was sat in the car with them. So it was really interesting to hear it. And it was this tale that was handed down through the family from father to son. And then he came and confirmed to us. So it was pretty good that we had that confirmation from the first hand from the son.
Was this the man who wanted to be dropped at the Beam Bridge?
I'm a little bit foggy on the story because we do post a few in, local ones a week. So I'm not really sure where he wanted, but he was picked up, sat in the back of the car, and, two independent people within the car, the husband and the wife, I think it was, both saw this guy, both had a conversation with him, and the conversation entailed for the entire journey. And I think they stopped to drop him off near a bed and breakfast or a hostel or something. I'm not exactly sure. My brain's not connecting to exactly the details on that one. But when they turned around to let him go, he was no longer there. So
the problem we may have here is that the A38 runs from Somerset through Gloucestershire, up past Berkeley, and then all the way up past Coventry, is it? The A38 is an incredibly long road, am I
I
correct?
think it goes to Derby, doesn't it?
Yeah, where did you have your experience? Was it in Somerset, Graham, or was it further north?
Yeah, it's in Somerset, so it's
Okay.
more or less where Caroline just described, but it was totally different to that, obviously. But
it's
yeah,
the Taunton part, the Wellington, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah, that's where he said he'd seen his as well.
yeah. But and I was aware of those stories already because obviously local people know this stuff, and
Right.
but it was my first ever encounter, I think, as well. So it was quite bizarre.
Okay, so we're seeing two types of cases coming out here: phantom hitchhikers and people who think they've hit something, and then and finally disappearing cars. And the issue of reflecting lights is always the issue in disappearing cars. It's so easy to think that you're seeing a car, but it's actually across a field or a tractor or a combine harvester at night. Well, maybe that's just because I grew up on the edge of the fens and the Breck, or in Denmark, which are not renowned for their hills. But I do find distant lights can be atmospheric distortion, especially on winter nights, can change where lights appear to be. But that isn't the case at the Three Nuns Bridges, I don't believe. Tom, do you know Thetford well? I was to Tom Ruffles, if. Okay, no response there. So any other questions, please? It's getting late, but we need to... Well, if you haven't got a Christmas present this year and you're looking to buy a present for someone, not me, because I've already got it, may I recommend this book? I don't know if you can see that. Can you see the book? It's Zones of Strangeness, an examination of paranormal and UFO hotspots by Peter McCue, and his two other books, which are Britain's Phantom Roads and Britain's Phantom Forests. I believe I've got the titles right. Is that correct?
No, the second one was titled Britain's Paranormal Forests Encounters in the Woods. It was actually not my title. I wanted the book to be called Paranormal Encounters in Britain's Woodlands, but the publishers thought it was going to be too clunky. That's the term they used. So I kind of reluctantly agreed to their title, but I didn't like the word paranormal, the expression paranormal forests. It means the forests themselves paranormal, but they thought it would be better to. But so that's the way it goes.
Right. Okay. Okay. We have another question. Tony asked a question earlier. Perhaps there's a little time around to get around to his question. Yeah. Tony's question, which we never got to answer, was about the book, was it not? Was there another question? Both events, which are historically true, I presume, little new sightings have occurred, so both legends, stories have simply fallen into the myth and legends category label. Tony, are you there, Mr. Hayes? Tony? Okay, well, Tony Hayes asked, both events, which are historically true, I presume, little new sightings have occurred and the stories have simply fallen into the myth and legend label, but that was... Yeah, I mean, is that the case, do you think? Do you think there was some authentic thing behind Souter fell, and it's simply that it was then picked up and reported by pamphleteers?
Well, I'd say that going to Edgehill first, I'm most doubtful about the Edgehill case. I mean, there may have been a few kind of reports of the odd apparition that maybe were picked up by people maybe in London who fabricated pamphlets, but the general stories about the conflict in testimony, the improbability, the doubts about the very existence of some of the signatories to the documents, I'm doubtful generally about that. Souter fell, I'm pretty doubtful because of such conflict. I mean, you've got one report says three separate events all on the same day of the year. The other version, just one event, different year altogether, actually. So, however, that report from that Mrs. Hovey, I mean, it's very weak evidence in a formal sense. I mean, the skeptics would say you can't rely on anything like that second-hand testimony. The woman couldn't even remember what the soldiers looked like. It's pretty weak evidentially. However, it just raises the possibility, could there have been the occasional episode of paranormal activity in the area which has been misunderstood or misreported or distorted? It's puzzling also because as far as I'm aware, there's never been a major battle at Souter fell, and it's also questionable whether any troops like that ever moved along the side of the hill. When I climbed it, it wasn't terribly precipitous, but the eastern side, I'd say coming up towards the ridge, the angle would make it a bit difficult for gun carriages and so on. I think if you were to go along the top of the ridge, which isn't terribly narrow, you could probably run cavalry and gun carriages along there, but it might be a bit difficult to have any kind of horse-drawn, carriages a bit lower down. So, and even the recipients at the time, I think, tended to think that it was visionary rather than physical, because people apparently, allegedly, according to either both or one of the pamphlets, went up the hill after the events and to sort of recovered horseshoes and couldn't find any trace of the events. So I'm uncertain, to be honest. I'm just uncertain. But what I am pretty sure about is that it's very questionable to take either of those reports at face value. And it's particularly bad not to consider both reports together in evaluating the case. And therefore, if you're on the internet and you get a story comes up about Souter fell and it only mentions one source, be very careful, because it's without knowing that there's a discrepancy between different reports, I don't think you can evaluate the case properly.
Yeah, I mean, discrepancies between reports are a factor of most historiography, unfortunately, or most historical writings. You look at the Gospels, there's the problems of the synoptic tradition,
Yes,
where you've got different narratives. But moving back, chairman at ASSAP.ac.uk, I've popped it in there. If anyone's got a road ghost or a forester experience or experience you'd like to share with ASSAP and with Peter, if you pop it to me, I'll forward it to him tonight. So if you'd like to type up your experiences, Graham, Caroline, anyone else who's got anything they'd like to pass to Peter, or just I will get Peter's email and email you back directly if you let me know. But yeah, let me know, and I'll pass cases on to Peter to investigate. Right. Okay. One last question from me then before we go back to the others. Souter, what time of year was it?
23rd June.
So midsummer, yeah, St. John's.
Midsummer, yes, yeah.
Well, yeah, okay. So at that time, but it's Midsummer's Eve, so it's not likely to be a fair. I was wondering, given the fact, when did the Highland Revolt begin? When did Bonnie Prince Charlie?
I actually intended to look that up. It was certainly 1645, but I think it was it may have been just after that. I'm not quite sure.
1745, yeah, it's the 45, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so if he's known to have landed, or if there is a strong Jacobite threat, is it possible that the local county yeomanry from one of the local towns took out a body of cavalry, maybe a squadron, 20 men, or, you know, something like 20 men, I would have thought, and went riding out and took up a position for an hour or so on top of a local hill that might act as a high point to look across the valley, was seen there and then moved? Because that was the thing that made me wonder if it might be a genuine sighting of a small body of cavalry that's just been exaggerated out of all sense.
I'll just quote from one of the reports, if I may, which, I mean, if you take these reports at face value, they don't. I'll take the Clark version.
Yeah.
Around 7:30 p.m. on the 23rd of June, 1744, by which time he was working as a servant for Mr. Lancaster's father, Daniel Strickett was walking a little above the house, Blake Hillside, that's presumably, when he saw a troop of men on horseback riding on Souter Fell side in pretty close ranks and at a brisk walk, which fits with what you're suggesting, of course. After observing the spectacle for some time, Strickett drew Lancaster's attention to it. They alerted the family to it, and everyone saw the phenomenon. The visionary horsemen seemed to come from the lowest part of the fell and first became visible at a place called Knott. Then they moved in regular troops along the side of the hill, and on coming opposite Blake Hills, they went over the fell. J. Clark states that frequently the last but one in a troop would leave his place, gallop to the front, and then take the same place with the rest, a regular swift walk, and that these changes happened to every troop, and oftener than once or twice, not at all times alike, and that the spectacle was seen by every person at every village within the distance of a mile. J. Clark states that from when Strickett first observed it, the phenomenon must have been visible for at least 2.5 hours before nightfall. It sounded as if it was a long stream of people rather than a kind of a small discrete group. I think if you had a block of houses and you had troops going around it and then rerunning, you know, in front of the building, that, you know, it could be accounted for in terms of a small group of people. But I think that sounds to me as if it's a big stream of people, a bit more than, say, 20 men.
But a troop is how many troops? Is it 4 squadrons to a troop? That would be 80 men. And a troop, a troop of cavalry would not be a huge number.
Yes.
But the thing is that if they're actually also doing what they're doing, it sounds like a cavalry exercise at the time. They're exercising the horses, so they're maintaining a walk or a canter, but then one of them is running their horse up and getting their horse to the front, then they're maintaining and they're swapping positions. But
if it'd just been 80 men, and if they'd been, even despite changing position within the group, if it had gone on for 2.5 hours, they would have had.
If Souter Fell is half a mile long or a mile long, appearing at Knott or whatever it's called at one end over the hill, and then they're disappearing quite naturalistically over the hill again and out of sight. They could be doing what Mussolini famously did when he took the salute from the Italian army in the early 30s or late 20s, when he stood on the balcony and had them, as you say, march around the corner so that the army.
I'd have to check the map, but my recollection is the western side of Souter Fell is pretty steep.
Oh, okay. So that rules that out then.
I doubt whether, I think on the eastern side you could probably double back, but I think I'll check the map after we finish this, but I think it's fairly steep. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wondered if it could just be physical troops.
That's right.
Jacobite
Yes.
performing, and then it's just entered into folklore.
Yeah. The other thing about it being a kind of exercise triggered off by concern about the Jacobites, we'd have to check the dates, because the Jacobite rebellion began, I think it was around the summer or autumn of that year. But if the rebellion began very soon after the sighting, I don't know whether there'd been time for news to have come down to England and for people to get organized. You know, it would have probably taken a bit of time before news came south.
I mean, this is the area of the Border Reivers. This is an area that has been throughout history. Though by this time, of course, yeah, you've got Scotland as well. Yeah, no, I'm probably wrong. Okay, then. Wendy says she's got a second-hand account of a road ghost she heard from a taxi driver in County Armagh. Would that count? Wendy, would you like to share that with us? And we'll make that our last question for tonight if Wendy's there.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
Hello. Hello.
Okay. I was told this story about 2 years ago. At the time, I used to get quite an early taxi to the train station, about 10 to 6 in the morning, to get to work on another campus quite a way away from where I work. And I got chatting to the taxi driver, and he was talking about that I was a very early taxi ride that he would take. It was one of the earliest times he would ever pick anyone up. And he said he felt quite uncomfortable with it sometimes because there weren't a lot of people about. It was dark, the street lights weren't great. And he told me a story of something that had happened to him a couple of years previously when he'd had an early call out for a taxi. It was about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning to take someone to a hospital appointment in Belfast, which is about 30, 40 miles away from where this place was. And he got lost. It was on country roads. They weren't signposted. Houses were few and far between. And as he was turning around, trying to find out where to go, he saw a woman standing by the side of the road. And he thought, great, well, this must be my fare. So he wound the window down and shouted at her, you know, you my fare, I'm going to pick you up. Are you Mrs. So-and-so? And she didn't react. So he called to her again, hello, hello, can you hear me? And she was looking straight at him, but didn't react. So he tried for a few more minutes, you know, getting more perplexed about why she wasn't responding. And then he just gave up and drove down the road. About 2, 3 houses down, there was someone at the house with the lights on and said, yeah, here I am, you're my fare. And he said, well, who's your woman down the road? In that house, 2 doors down, no one lives there. The woman died several months previously. There's no one there. The house has been empty, it's abandoned, there's no one there. No, there was a woman standing outside there. She wouldn't answer me. And this was early in the morning before 6 a.m. It was summer at the time, but she was wearing a coat and a hat and gloves, and she was dressed as if it was winter. And when he told the story to the woman who just got into his taxi, she got out and wouldn't get in the car with him because he said that's her neighbour. She used to stand there and that's what she used to wear. So
sorry, hear what you said there. When he told the story to the woman who got into the car, she got out because she
was just frightened. That was
frightened,
her
yes.
neighbour. She didn't want to go in the car. She was spooked.
Right.
So that was annoying for him because it was a very early taxi fare. He'd driven around for ages and it ended up no good. But he was quite frightened by that. And he said he'd never really liked going down that road ever since.
Well, that was a fantastic ghost story. And on that note, we'll have to leave it for tonight because I've got to go and give my cat insulin. So thank you very, very much. And I hope you've all had a good evening. Thank you for Peter, who's always a wonderful